After I'd finished my PhD at Johns Hopkins, I went to work at the National Institutes of Health. And they offered me this job and they said, hey, you speak French. We've worked in Africa. We'd like you to take on this role. We're going to go evaluate Congo as a site and we think you'd be perfect for it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm in. And they were like, no, we said Congo. Right. Okay. Congo, like the Democratic. I was like, yeah, no, I'm in. This is perfect. I love it. This is where I've always wanted to go work. And so they're like, oh, okay, crazy lady.
Good morning, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk, a place to talk about stories in all their forms, the craft that goes into them, and the role that art plays in our lives. I'm Cole Haddon, and today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Anne Rimoin, Professor of Epidemiology at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. She's also the Gordon-Levin Endowed Chair in Infectious Diseases and Public Health, the Director of the Center for Global and Immigrant Health, and an internationally recognized expert on emerging infections, global health, surveillance systems, and vaccination. So, a bit of a lightweight compared to my usual guests. I'll be telling you more about this remarkable person in a moment, but first, I want to remind you that 5 a.m. Story Talk isn't just a place to talk about the literal craft of storytelling, but also our culture and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of this beautiful, spectacularly messed up world we call home. I invite guests like Dr. Rimoin to join me for these chats to help us explore some of the biggest questions and challenges facing our civilization, while also hopefully grasping at how the arts might similarly address them. Dr. Rimoin will be doing exactly that today. I want you to try to imagine she and I sitting together at a cafe at some ungodly hour, or if you're in America, a diner where we get to know each other over coffee and greasy food. This podcast, as I've previously explained, is intended to try to recapture a kind of manic early morning energy I experienced when I was much, much younger, dropping into a booth with friends after a long night out, still feeling a bit drunk, so we could get into it about the arts, the world, everything. I miss those conversations. I miss those friends. I miss the blissful ignorance we all shared at the time about what was coming our way as adults, but also our culture's way. How things have changed, haven't they? You might have noticed this podcast is trying to confront how confusing our world has become. A couple of weeks ago, I alluded to my own personal convictions that my art needs to try to directly take on and make sense of what's happening. Maybe that's what appealed to me so much about having Dr. Rimoin as a guest on 5 a.m. Story Talk. After all, I think art has done an incredibly shit job at helping us as a culture process the COVID pandemic, which she and I will discuss. I'll be interested to get your own thoughts about this in the comments. As for Dr. Rimoin, or Anne Rimoin, she's an epidemiologist. Put another way, her expertise is infectious diseases, their characteristics, and the factors that influence their spread. But part of this is helping communities, countries, the public in general, prepare for future epidemics, which are localized outbreaks, and pandemics, which are, of course, global, like COVID, the Spanish flu, or the Black Death. The focus of much of her life's work has been in Africa, where she was on the ground for the monkeypox, or Mpox as it's now known, outbreak in the early part of the 2000s. Africa is a lifelong passion of hers, which ultimately changed her life when she served in the Peace Corps there in Benin. We're going to talk about all this and much more, including how the arts have helped her scientific work, her love affair with Congo in particular, and what the experience of navigating the wildly diverse subcultures in Congo, a place with more than 200 languages, taught her about how to communicate about science. Obviously, we're also going to talk about the state of the sciences in 2025, meaning in Trump's America, where every scientist I know describes a kind of assault on research unparalleled in modern times. What lessons did we, as a civilization, learn from COVID? Did we learn any? And if not, why not? What factors prevented us from coming together to prepare for the next pandemic that is almost certainly coming our way? Perhaps the highly contagious H1N1 virus, also known as the avian flu. If you're a storyteller, Anne and I are also going to discuss at length disease in the arts, from Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11 to films like Outbreak and Contagion to a favorite film of hers, At Play in the Fields of the Lord. All of this might sound a lot like doom and gloom, and yeah, maybe it is. But Anne and I also laugh our asses off. If the 5 a.m. Story Talk podcast is going to spend time exploring how art can take on the challenges of life in the 21st century, it's also going to try to remind us about the beauty that still exists in abundance and can be described as everything we're fighting to hold on to here. If someone like Anne, given everything she's seen and knows about how our world can come crashing down, if she can still find a reason to laugh and hope, so can I, and so should you. When this episode is done, you're going to want to stick around for the bonus episode, of course. Dr. Anne Rimoin will be back to discuss a seminal piece of art from her life, the song Imoyo from Ricardo Lemvo and his band Máquina Loca. I'm going to keep bringing you intimate conversations like these, as well as deeper and deeper minisodes about the arts and storytelling. So be sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Your likes and comments are appreciated and hugely helpful to a new podcast like this one trying to get the word out about itself. And don't forget, you can find links to things discussed in today's episode, as well as to the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter in the show notes. Now, let's dive in with my guest, Dr. Anne Rimoin. All right. Do you like going by Annie or Anne?
Well, so professionally, I usually go by Anne, but my friends all call me Annie. So, I mean, I would say this would be a conversation with Anne Rimoin, but please call me Annie.
Well, thank you for being here today, Annie. It's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. It's been interesting last few months.
It has. So diving in, I want to ask about that. In a world where the ways our civilization might end are multiplying every year, from climate change, nuclear weapons, your area of terror, pandemics, which is all over the news at the moment. How are you sleeping at night? And do you? And if so, what drugs are you using?
Well, clearly I'm not finding any good ones, so I have to find some good ways to keep everybody calm, including myself. No, it's been a complicated moment for science, and I think that this is just a moment where there's so much uncertainty, so much disruption and chaos everywhere that we're all feeling a little bit unsettled.
But in the literal sense of that question, I always imagine somebody who knows as much as you must live with a degree of terror, because I have trouble sleeping. My anxiety's through the roof. So somebody who's so intimate with what is happening in the world, who constantly has reports, showing up in her email, how does that affect your mental health? Have you just found a way to balance that?
Well, I've spent my career working in complicated places and dealing with complicated problems and dealing with complicated politics. And you can't separate public health from politics. It's inherently political as much as we'd like to separate it. So, I think I'm used to some of this uncertainty and chaos. And I worry about the state of public health. I worry about that locally. I worry about it globally. And, as I've said probably 1,000 times on the news or in publications, an infection anywhere is potentially an infection everywhere. So it's really important that we are doing everything we can to double down on disease surveillance and public health strategy and improving health, because that's what's going to keep us safe from whatever the next infectious threat is. It's all interrelated. So, it's nothing that anybody else hasn't already said. I'm saying the same thing. It's common sense.
Hmm. Well, in that regard, can you tell my listeners what the focus of your work is? How do you
Sure.
pitch yourself at a party?
So I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm a professor at UCLA, and my official titles include I'm the Gordon-Levin Endowed Chair in Infectious Diseases and Public Health. I'm the director of the Center for Global and Immigrant Health, and I'm the director and the founder of the UCLA DRC Health Research and Training Program, which is a program that focuses on infectious diseases in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
That's impressive. And so on a day-to-day basis, what does that mean for you? What is the focus of your work at the moment? I guess what's distracting you the most at the moment?
Well, when you're a professor at a university, you wear a lot of hats. And so I'm a professor at UCLA. I teach infectious disease epidemiology and emerging infectious disease epidemiology and global epidemiology, how to do studies in very remote rural places with logistically complex, low resource settings. So that's part of my job. I advise students, I serve on committees, and then I run this research program in the Congo and globally. I also work globally. But what I'm really known for is this work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I have this really big research program that's been in place for 23 years. Something I'm so proud of and so attached to. We have, vehicles and apartments and laboratory and a lot of staff on the ground, and my doctoral students have all gone and spent time there, and I have staff that live there full time, and I myself lived in the Congo full time, off and on for years before I had to, really be rooted here in the United States. Because as you kind of go up the ranks, you have to teach and you have to spend more time on campus, and then also I ended up having a personal life here too. So I'm married, and so I not as ready to just run off to Congo at any given moment, but I spent the vast majority of my career doing just that. And so now I'm kind of the old lady that directs everything and lets all the young people have all the fun.
The old lady. Uh, we'll get into the Congo in a moment because I'm very interested about that. But was your life's goal always disease? When we've spoken about this before, I think you suggested that there was a moment in time when you might have gone into the music
Sure.
world. So how did you end up here?
So, well, it's a little bit of a windy path, as all
Of course.
the interesting stories are. But so I grew up in here in Los Angeles in Palos Verdes, and I really did not think I would actually do anything in science. My dad was a really well-known, well-respected medical geneticist, and so I think I was very intimidated by that. I actually went a totally different route. My undergrad degree was history with a focus in Africa. And my minor was music. I was a musician. I was always really interested in music, always played a lot of music. And when I graduated from Middlebury College in Vermont, I came home and actually took an internship working at IRS Records, which was a record company, kind of a seminal new wave record company. Oingo Boingo, the English Beat, all these kind of fun bands of the 80s. It was run by Miles Copeland, who's Stuart Copeland's brother, right? So I was working there in a summer, like an internship, thinking maybe I want to go become like a music entertainment lawyer, do something in the music industry. But I was also really fighting this love of Africa and wanting to do something globally. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to go into the Peace Corps. And I'll spend 2 years in the Peace Corps. It'll make me more qualified to go to law school and to do something, serious on that side. And so I applied to the Peace Corps because I spoke French, and it was really easy to get qualified at that moment just by taking like an EMT course for health. It's not like that anymore. It's not so simple. But I qualified to go to Benin, a little country in West Africa. And they put me in this perfect public health program, the guinea worm eradication program. And they basically sent me to a small village in Benin and gave me a little motorbike and taught me how to do disease surveillance. And that kind of set the course of my life. I ended up, after Peace Corps, getting a master's in public health at UCLA, and then working in disease surveillance, and then going on to get my PhD at Johns Hopkins, and then started working in Congo.
Did the realization that this was going to be your focus happen while you were in the Peace Corps, or did you work that out once you got back to university?
Well, I think it really was this, spending time in the Peace Corps. It's a really unique experience, and you get sent and you work and live in a village essentially by yourself for 2 years, really integrated. And I really understood the importance of public health, and I think once I really understood what it was to make a difference and to really impact people's lives, and that you could really impact lives with simple interventions. And it was so fulfilling to me. The path was clear. I mean, instead of taking the LSAT when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I decided at that point I was going to go back and get a master's in public health. So the experience was it totally changed my life. And, the Peace Corps, it was the hardest thing I ever did. It's a very tough experience, a lot of social isolation. You're by yourself in a village for 2 years. And at that point, we didn't have phones and internet and all these other things, which can make it a very different experience. I mean, although I still think it's challenging for people, but it's challenging in different ways now. But that was really complicated, and I was not somebody that had ever gone camping. I mean, my family was like going to a pool without it. Going to a hotel without a pool was, like the most remote we had been. So to live in a village for, almost 2 years was definitely a life-changing experience.
I'm curious about I think a lot of people think, oh, I should join the Peace Corps. There's a sense of adventure to that. And the reality of it, of course, is much more extreme. But we also live in a world where people aren't joining the Peace Corps anymore. The service isn't appreciated or encouraged the same way it was when JFK launched it. And so how do we get more people to join the Peace Corps today? I guess is really the question I'm asking.
No, I totally get what your question is. It's a really good question. And the old slogan for Peace Corps, which certainly resonated with all of us Gen Xers and the boomers, and was, it's the toughest job you'll ever love. And that was so true. It was the most challenging thing I ever did, and it changed me fundamentally. It changed me so, my whole perspective on the world. And it was really hard, but it was really special. And I don't know that resonates with people in the same way today that it did, but there, it's unique because it's different than working. Today I work on this macro level, but to go to working in a village and really being on a local level and really interacting with people and living amongst people who have to struggle every single day in so many ways, and then maybe don't struggle in other ways that we do, but to really understand that perspective, it changes you forever. And it also changes how somebody like me thinks about public health and thinks about all of this, because you have to understand what's happening at a community level. You have to interact with people. You have to understand where they're coming from. And you have to, the village that I lived in was a little town called Bopa, which was in southern Benin. It was right on this lake, and it was called Le Royaume de Fétiche. It was the kingdom of voodoo. And the chief fetisher for all of West Africa lived very close by in a neighboring village with like 80 wives. This is not an exaggeration. And voodoo was the main religion there. And everything in life kind of centered around these very central beliefs. And I was working on this disease called guinea worm, which is a waterborne disease. And you drink water, and 9 to 12 months later, you end up with a worm that comes out of usually your leg or your foot, out of an extremity. And it's almost eradicated now, thanks to the Carter Foundation and UNICEF. But, it's very complicated to be able to explain to people that, no, this is something that happens 9 to 12 months ago. And now this is coming out of your leg or your foot, and it's because you're drinking this water that's infested with these little water fleas that you can't really see. And so I think having those experiences and understanding by living with people and really meeting people where they are, and trying to understand how do you explain this to people, how do you show people, how do you try and demonstrate how this is happening, is a really important skill. And especially today, in today's world, where I think, we deal with so many fundamentally different beliefs and belief systems and belief structures, and we're not taking that very well into account when we're trying to communicate health, right? You have to meet people where they are.
Part of your career today is, I think I could describe it as a science communicator. Can you trace a line back to your experience of what you're describing, of learning how to communicate with people where they are, to becoming this public communicator today?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that experience of just living in these places and, really understanding and becoming integrated into a community that's so foreign and so ultimately different from, where I had been really allowed me to have a better understanding and to develop friendships and relationships in those areas was just really important. But I do think certainly, some of the things that were most effective. I mean, perfect example of things that it wasn't my idea. It was an idea that somebody at UNICEF had, is that the best way to communicate, to get information in a place like in Benin about guinea worm, about something that people didn't really understand, was to have a song contest about guinea worm. And so it started out in these little tiny villages, and you'd have the guinea worm song contest. All the villages would compete and come up with a song about guinea worm and what you needed to do, where it came from, what it was like, how it worked, and then translating into song. And then you'd have the village level first, and then you'd have the commune level next, and then the sous-prefecture village, like the county level, and then they competed, and then the official song in Benin was a song. They had a song contest, and ultimately it was a great way to spread all of this information and public health and science to people by really integrating it into something that was very much part of that community, which was traditional song. So yeah, I mean, I think that experience in and of itself was so valuable to me, because you really do understand you have to get way out of your own head and out of your own context if you're going to communicate something effectively. And it doesn't help to talk to people who already believe you. That's not useful. But if you're going to talk to people who don't believe you, you cannot be condescending. You cannot be righteous. You cannot make assumptions. You have to meet people where they are. And questions are fair game.
So you come back from the Peace Corps, you decide to go back to university to become a scientist. At that point, does your father feel very smugly satisfied?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think he was definitely relieved to see me in science, because my dad was really, I mean, he really worshipped at the altar of science. And so I think that really, it was something he could connect to. I mean, he would have been happy for me to do anything that I was happy with. He really would have been, but it was definitely a place that he was comfortable with and something that we could talk about. And actually, before I was born, my father worked in the Central African Republic, working with pygmy communities. His expertise was related to skeletal dysplasias and short stature. And so essentially in endocrinology, doing work on, basically why pygmies were short, and that had to do with resistance to growth hormones. So, and his study, I think that was something that, so I think I felt very drawn to Africa, like comfortable with it. Both my parents, my mom went with my dad to Africa. They had all of this time and, out there. And I think it was a very special time for him, but he hadn't been back to Africa since the 60s, since before I was born. But I think, we had African art in the house, and, I think there was a very positive association with it. I think he really, I think he really liked it. And he did actually come back to Benin and actually to Congo to visit me. And he really enjoyed that too.
That's lovely. So you have, I see instruments behind you. Are those yours or your husband's?
They are mine. My husband is a musician, and a very accomplished musician, with a degree from the Berklee School of Music. And I am not that. He is very, very talented. I'm a middling musician. But yes, this guitar right here is mine, and there's an acoustic in the corner, also mine. That acoustic was mine since college. This guitar here actually belonged to Don Dokken, from the band Dokken. I think you might remember.
Yes, I know.
Don is a friend of mine and used to live down the street from us, and was very kind to give me one of his guitars. And I cherish this particular electric that I do not play anywhere near as well as he does, but I'm very glad to have it.
Well, the reason I ask is going back to the potential music route, which you were talking about law, but still the arts matter to you. And our mutual friend David Eisenman suggested there's a beauty to epidemiology in his mind, not dissimilar to math or physics. Creativity, he said, is inherent in the field, which I'm not sure I've seen enough in films and TV series that tackle the subject. Do you think a creative mind has been necessary to what you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't, I mean, epidemiology is the study of disease in populations, right? And events in populations. And you have to be creative to be able to really be able to capture everything as a, we're also called as an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm also called a disease detective, right? So to be able to get to the root of what may be causing a disease of unknown origin, or to be able to better understand disease, you have to be able to think about things in a creative way. There's definitely a lot of art to it, a lot of intuition, and a lot of the work that I do and the work that I've done, has really come back to my heart and to my love of Africa, being drawn to it, and just my connection to people, because you have to be able to connect with people and to be able to talk to people. And especially if you do global health, this is not parachute science. You don't just run over to a new place and say, hey, I want to do work here. I mean, you have to respect people. You have to be able to understand the culture and the population and what they want to do if you're going to be able to work there. And my work in Congo really was a place I'd always kind of thought about. Everybody has a country that they're always, that they really kind of are interested in. And it was Congo for me. Congo was this incredibly dramatic story of, decolonization, and that whole story in and of itself is worth 17,000 podcasts and movies and other things that need to be written. Just by the way, writer. And so things that really need to be thought about, they're very important. And in Congo, music plays a very important role in their history. And this is also the birthplace of rumba, and the connection between all of these different cultures and continents. It all kind of comes back there. So, this kind of connection of the heart is so important too. And that's where art is it's
Mm.
connection to heart and soul, and the physical manifestation of it, or the auditory manifestation of it, right?
Let's say there's a difference between the early love affair, the fantasy of a place, and then the reality of it. They're two different experiences. And so you had a fantasy of the Congo and then confronted with the reality. Why was it so easy to fall in love with it? What do you love so much about the country, the people, the culture?
Well, it's like a mix of all of these things, but I think it really was because I was so, there's a piece of it that's just personality. And I think that the overall Congo, is a place where people are very warm, they're funny, they really like to laugh and to joke. If there's music, they're dancing. If there's, they're out there like enjoying life when they can, but it's also very intense and very serious and very layered. And, it's this big mix of cultures. There are like 217 languages, official languages in Congo, and so many
Mm.
different ethnic groups that in between. So it's just a very, layered place culturally. But then it's also a place where there've been, these like important, popular, iconic moments, like the Rumble in the Jungle, right? I mean, you think about, the Muhammad Ali, George Foreman fight that was there, and all the music. I mean, there've been documentary after documentary about the music that was part of that period as well. And then the mix of politics and music and all at the same time. I just think that there's so many different lines there. There's just so much to be interested in there. And then when I got there, I think, I got there in 2002, and it was after I'd finished my PhD at Johns Hopkins. I went to work at the National Institutes of Health, and they offered me this job, and they said, hey, you speak French. We'd like you to, you've worked in Africa. We'd like you to take on this role to, potentially we're going to go evaluate Congo as a site, and we think you'd be perfect for it. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm in. And they were like, no, we said Congo. right? Okay, Congo, like the Democratic. I was like, yeah, no, I'm in. This is perfect. I love it. This is where I've always wanted to go work. And so they're like, oh, okay, crazy lady, is like, have at it. And I got there, and so I just think, I was in my early 30s, and I just was like this place I kind of, always had this interest in, and I got there, and I think my enthusiasm, I was young, and I already spoke a couple Bantu languages, so it was really easy for me to learn, because my Peace Corps experience, it was really easy for me to pick up some words in Lingala, and I just think it was 2002, it was the end of the Civil War there. There were very few expatriates there. So I think it was kind of this mix of things, and my exuberance and interest, and I had such great access to these really important people in science there. I mean, Jean-Jacques Moyembe, the guy who discovered Ebola, and the dean of the Kinshasa School of Public Health. And I think they just thought it was great. And they were like, great, let's go do this work. And so I kind of had this amazing open access. But I just think it was this like weird confluence of things. It was timing, and timing is everything. It's my husband's late father used to say, the difference between salad and garbage is timing. And I think that is so perfect, right? I mean, it's such a perfect way to look at it, because it was just timing. And I think if I had been in any other country, it might not have been so easy. It's like such a uniquely warm, wonderful place. And the person, it's like chemistry. It's the personalities of people. And that, I had people who were, they were funny and liked to joke and liked to talk about music. And then I already knew a lot about African music and could connect about African music and all these other things. It's just like chemistry and maybe some good karma in there somewhere.
Your area of work there was monkeypox, correct?
So I originally went to DRC to work on a study that was related to malaria and pregnancy. But when I was there, one of my mentors at Johns Hopkins was D.A. Henderson, and he was responsible for the eradication of smallpox. It's just an amazing story of D.A. Henderson. And so when I got there, it was really interesting, because I was talking to Professor Moyembe in his office, just trying to get to know him and trying to think about how this malaria study would happen. And he mentioned to me that there were cases of monkeypox, which now is called Mpox. And he said, there are a lot of increasing cases. And because I'd done a lot of disease surveillance, and because I'd lived in villages and I'd done this kind of disease surveillance, I knew that it was just the tip of the iceberg. And so he said, oh yeah, we have all these samples and they're sitting here in our lab, and, but we can't get them tested because nobody's interested in testing them. And, we don't have the funds to do it. So I literally took my entire per diem for my time there, and I handed it to the INRB, the national lab, and they sent it to a lab in Germany and got those samples tested. And that was how this project started. But I think it was kind of that spirit of oh, well, let's just figure it out and, get this done, that, kind of kickstarted all of it. And that's how I ended up working on monkeypox, was that it was, I had the ability to pitch studies as well. And so I came back from this trip and said, listen, I really want to do an add-on study and look at monkeypox. And at the time, the head of the Office of AIDS Research was a man named Jack Weitzcarver. And he said, listen, well, if you can get data on HIV at the same time, we'll fund the study. So we ended up having this supplementary study that I was able to lead as this very junior person on Mpox. And so there I was working on Mpox in DRC. And that's how this project got started.
How is Mpox today in the DRC?
And it's something so it was this niche thing that nobody really cared about. I mean, to me, it was really interesting because it was this vaccine preventable disease that had, essentially had taken the opportunity once smallpox had been eradicated and people were no longer having this vaccine to kind of hold the door against this pox virus, was able to start spreading in the population. Because when we eradicated smallpox from the planet, we stopped vaccinating against smallpox. And that meant that you now had all these cohorts of people that were being born. And remember, you have a lot younger people, age structure is much younger in places like Africa. So all of a sudden you started to see more and more cases of Mpox over time. And it was as vaccine immunity was waning and seeing overall in the population, you started to see these cases. And so it's kind of like this whole idea of no good deed goes unpunished, right? You eradicate smallpox, one of the greatest public health victories in the history of the world is eradicating smallpox, which was a terrible disease. But it does crack the door open for these other pox viruses to start spreading. And so in Congo, where mpox or the monkeypox virus is actually it is resident in a number of animal species that are regularly eaten, and that it actually mostly rodents and squirrels. It's called monkeypox because it was first discovered in monkeys in 1958 in Copenhagen when they were doing vaccine studies. And it was just because monkeys are incidental hosts just like humans. So it's really like a squirrel pox or a rodent pox, which sounds a lot less interesting than monkeypox virus. So anyway, in any case, it was just this really interesting case study in what happens when you eradicate a disease, you stop vaccinating, and what happens next. And so it took time to see these cases continue to increase and continue to increase. And then all of a sudden we had a public health emergency when we saw the global emergence of it. So it's become something very interesting. But I had a lot of people say, monkeypox, who cares about monkeypox? Especially when I was going up for tenure. Who cares about that? Why are we on this virus? So yeah.
So much of, I guess, at least my understanding of a life of an epidemiologist is in treatment, it's prevention, it's disease prevention. We're also both American, you're working in America, switching to what's going on there at the moment. How are things going in that regard in terms of disease prevention, preparedness for another pandemic? I get to read endlessly about H1N1 and the potential for avian flu being exponentially worse than COVID. Is it as bad as those articles make it sound?
Well, absolutely. I mean, listen, it's a situation where another one of my late father-in-law's wonderful sayings is it's much easier to stay out of trouble than it is to have to get out of trouble. And that could not be more true than when it comes to pandemics and pandemic diseases of pandemic potential. And, certainly we've seen that over and over and over again. We certainly saw that with COVID. And H5N1 is something that I'm very concerned about. I'm very, very concerned about high path influenza. We're seeing multiple spillovers. We're understanding more and more that there are a lot of species that are susceptible to avian influenza. We've now seen several cases of serious or fatal infections. I think we're not that far. We've seen that the data suggests that we're only a few small changes away from human to human transmission. So, I do think that we are in a situation that is very precarious and we should be doubling down on prevention. And, our public health infrastructure is not being prioritized. It's being stripped down right now. And I just think it's a very complicated moment. There are always going to be a lot of priorities and a lot of things, a lot of competing priorities. There always are. There are never enough resources to be able to hit everything, but it's very dangerous to be pulling down public health infrastructure and the ability to be able to study diseases that are of, in particular, pandemic potential at this moment.
Do you think the world's governments learned enough from COVID in terms of preparedness? Outside of the US, which is clearly a mess, as we're alluding to, is at least the rest of the world significantly more prepared for a pandemic?
I don't think so. I think we keep, this is the story of we keep repeating ourselves over and over again. I feel like this is like, in Battlestar Galactica, we're like, this has all happened before and it'll happen again. And that the reboot was amazing. It was like my favorite.
Yes.
My husband and I talk about it all the time, and I'm always making references to Battlestar Galactica. But this has all happened before and it will happen again. It's not just the Cylons that are saying it. It is truth. And I really do think that that's, something that we just don't seem to learn. And sure, it takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of investment when, in times, not just in times of war, with viruses, but in times of peace as well. And I think that that's the hard thing that nobody seems to have learned. And there are never enough resources to be able to do this. You know, we're very careful when it comes to war, right? But we don't think about this in the same way. And it really is the same idea, is that you must be prepared. You must have a good defense. You must, be proactive, because again, it's going to be a lot harder to dig ourselves out of the hole that we're in. And that is not just, it is absolutely not just in the United States. It is everywhere.
Have you read Station 11,
Yes.
the novel?
Yes.
So as a storyteller, post-apocalyptic scenarios are, sort of stock and trade. I've written many. I enjoy reading them. But Station 11, 99% of humanity is wiped out by the flu in that, which sounds extraordinary. But then you go to the Black Death, it's 30 to 60% of Europe. And during its actual dense periods, I'm sure that number was more 75 to 80% of communities were wiped out, which kind of paints Europe as a ghost town. As a storyteller, I'm curious, but also as a human being, is that scenario actually possible in the 21st century with our medical and scientific capabilities? Could the Black Death even happen again? I mean, it would be bad, but could it happen at that level with who we are as a civilization today?
I mean, I hope not. And I mean, I think unless it was
That's not reassuring.
I really hope not. But I do think what we've seen is that the bigger problem. Okay, so one of the when I give a lecture, whenever I give my first lecture in my class on infectious disease, I always like to bring up. I show a picture of. What I say is, when we were growing up, the thing that we were most worried about was a nuclear holocaust, right? And the day after was this, the scariest tale that there was, right? The day after was what we all thought of. And I flashed this picture of the day after, which now our students have any idea what I'm talking about, and including any of my references to anything. So that's a whole different issue. But maybe Battlestar Galactica. But now that's even the reboot is old now. But anyway. But I digress. And so then what I do is I say, well, we've seen a lot of these movies like Outbreak and Contagion, which was very realistic, written by my friend Scott Burns. So realistic as to, what we could see happen. But what I think is most interesting is if you think about the taglines for both of those, far before this pandemic happened. And the tagline for Outbreak, the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman and Rene Russo and the wonderful cast. Do you know what the tagline was?
No, I don't remember.
Trying to stay calm. And then for Contagion, it was nothing spreads like fear. And I think that those two taglines really tell you a lot, things that we could predict, right? But are really, a big piece of this. And I think what everybody underestimated when it came to the pandemic was what was going to happen to society. And, nothing spreads like fear. And we got a taste of that during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, right? Everybody was terrified it was going to come here, and we're shutting all of our borders and trying to figure out, how to, I mean, Ebola is not nearly as contagious as COVID. It's totally different. I mean, it's much more dramatic, but it's not nearly as contagious. But, COVID was so insidious because it was so contagious. And avian influenza can be so contagious. So, I mean, I do think, we have a lot to worry about. But will we... so I worry less about the actual ability to be able to get something done or to develop a vaccine, but the breakdown of society. And I think we've seen so much of that. And I think if we go through another pandemic, I really worry about what that looks like and what that does to society, to politics, to the way that people interact with each other. And I think that what we've really learned is that this, kind of thin fabric that we have is already stretched so thin that those are things, when you see these apocalyptic movies, a lot of it is about the breakdown of society, right? Mm-hmm. All the Walking Dead shows, all of these, zombie apocalypse movies, all of that is about the breakdown of society and how we're just barely stitched together, that it can come apart and unravel so quickly. And I think that that's more true than ever. And as you see things kind of changing over time too, and then you bring in, the change of, how social media interacts and how quickly things go viral, right? It all goes viral so quickly, and information and disinformation and misinformation, and what that can set off in terms of chain reactions, and what that does to society. I just think that nobody really thought about that. And that has been, so important. And now with the advent of AI, the potential for how much faster things can change, I think it's all scary.
This might be a good place to ask about something we touched on during an earlier conversation we had, and you should feel free to disagree with me. But I've argued many times, including in newspapers where I've written articles about it, that global trauma requires an artistic response, not dissimilar to, I think, an immune response to disease. That something unspeakable happens and art has to quickly leap in to help us process it, and more specifically develop a kind of collective myth around it that allows us to speak about it as one. However, that for one of the only times in the history of the 20th and 21st century didn't happen with COVID. And it feels as if in that abdication of that role, the arts, which is not a sort of monolithic entity, but because it wasn't expressed in film and television specifically, people got it from social media, which is a Babel-like hellscape,
Yeah.
and they just got their hellscape reflected back to them. Whatever was terrible in them, I think just sort of it was a feedback loop of hate and ignorance and confusion and the worst of us rather than the best of us. Does that speak to you at all from your perspective?
For sure. I mean, I think that that makes a lot of sense. Science can tell us what's happening, but you need like a story to tell us what it means, right? And for people to really internalize it, I think, on from the general public. It wasn't that the purpose of all of these myths and all of these other things that happened, before us, and people used stories to be able to explain all of this. But now I agree with you. You have all of this kind of misinformation and disinformation, and so much political discord, and all of it is kind of coming together. I think it all kind of got jumbled. And I do think that we will see this expressed in art over time, and maybe get some catharsis from it. But I feel like people today, they don't want to talk about it, right? Like, it's too traumatic. It's too, it people don't have that catharsis right now from discussing it in the way that I think maybe we've thought about those things in the past. I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of interest in discussing it, right? I mean, there were a few TV shows that kind of like the morning show incorporated it,
Mhm.
right? Like the only show I think that actually really incorporated what was happening in real time into it. But I think, a lot of, Hollywood today is really escapism, right? And I think that there hasn't been a lot of great storytelling around this, or for people to find a way to have good storytelling around it. Although we do like zombie apocalypse movies and TV shows, but we don't like it about things where you have to wear a mask.
Yes. I work on 3 different continents, and for the 3 years after COVID, all I heard over and over was, "People aren't ready for it. It's too soon." I pitched because I was here in Australia. I spent a week or 10 days in quarantine in a quarantine hotel, and I thought, "Oh, there are love stories where you're falling in love with the person at the balcony next to you that you can't reach," but this sort of fantasy world of being trapped there, even that, you couldn't even spin a positive version of it. It was no conversation at all about it. It would not be tolerated.
Well, I think that we, I don't know if all cultures are this way, but I think in Western society, there's very little appetite to really rehash it except for in the blame game, right?
Mm.
And I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, that how this, this kind of trauma or this experience is not really a big part of it. But if you think about it, I mean, how many stories were there? Like, what was the worst public health event that happened that everybody knew about? It was the influenza epidemic, the global epidemic of 1918.
Mm.
And I have to say, there are not a lot of movies and TV shows about that.
That's true. So one of the interesting things about the Spanish flu is that there wasn't much that you could do in cinema at the time. But
Mhm.
by the time World War One happened, they were regularly making movies during the war. So
Mhm.
they didn't wait till later. They were already working out what the language of it was. And during World War Two, there were some 600 and something movies made about World War Two. They didn't discuss it later. 9/11, there were still movies made within 2 or 3 years of it. Television directly addressed it. The biggest show in America, or at least one of them, The West Wing, did a 9/11 episode in
Mhm.
almost real time. Nobody pretended these things away. The only other significant trauma I can identify that's global, that in some way affected people around the globe, is the Holocaust. And they pretended that away to such a degree Germans didn't even know it happened until the Holocaust miniseries came out in the late 70s, I think it was. This is way off topic at this point, but I fixate on this so much because if we had paid attention to COVID, would we be having the same level of stupid conversation we're having about H1N1 right now?
Well, okay. So I think this is actually a really interesting discussion, because one of the things I've thought a lot about this in terms of, like, when you think about movies about disease, right? Like, you think about these kinds of things. Like, I really think going back to the Spanish flu is really important in this, because, I mean, it would have been even in like the 30s and 40s when cinema was really starting to take hold. I mean, people were not making films about it. I think about, even in knowing, I mean, before COVID, I mean, we talk about the Spanish flu, the pandemic, that pandemic, and in a very significant way, and as a memory of what happened. But the only, like, I think back to, well, where would I have seen movies or TV shows? I mean, I remember there was like an episode of Downton Abbey where you had, I can't remember, it was one of the main characters died from the Spanish flu, right? And it wasn't very specific, right? It was kind of an easy way to get her out so
Hmm.
Matthew could marry what's her face and, like, find Mary, Lady Mary. And so, and then I think about, like, maybe even with things like plague or, other pandemics, other major influences. I think somewhere maybe in what was the Tudors, there was some, moment of worry about disease. I mean, obviously, I think about disease a lot, right? So, but it's really interesting that we don't take those. There are a lot of these kind of like the Andromeda strain, or in The Walking Dead, it starts out as kind of like a rabies like illness that spreads. We don't really we don't talk about disease very much at all. If you think about it in movies, it's really something that makes people uncomfortable. I mean, it
Hmm.
must be, right? Like, it must be that, because it's very complicated. I mean, even you think about like HIV, something that we all know and have experienced. That the movie Philadelphia was a very intense movie about this, and I think that Tom Hanks won the Academy Award for it, or the movie won
Hmm.
the Academy. I mean, it was a really important movie. But really, we do not talk a lot about disease. Like, as I think, I'm just thinking about it as we're talking about it, but we really don't. Well, the one movie I always think about, and I always use it as an example, of course, nobody knows this movie anymore either, is At Play in the Fields of the Lord. Do you remember that?
Hmm.
Like, it's
Yes,
an
yeah.
amazing movie. Everybody should watch At Play in the Fields of the Lord. If you can find it, watch it. I mean, it's one of those movies that has, this incredible, huge cast. It was, it was about Brazilian missionaries. And there was a point where, one of the missionaries gave a cold to one of the local people, and it totally decimated them. They all got very sick. So it was kind of a little bit of a storyline there too. But, like, I can remember these things, they're just like very small moments.
Hmm.
People don't like disease.
I agree, but
Movies.
there is something perhaps somebody smarter than me, at least, to interrogate the fact that when COVID happened, the very first thing people did during lockdown was run to films about disease. You know, they wanted outbreak, they wanted contagion, and people were rewatching them, which is insane in hindsight. I wanted to get as far away from it as possible. I wanted to watch Mamma Mia and Bridget Jones.
I watched all the Gilmore. I was like, yes, please. Thank you.
Yes. And yet people needed it. And I think that's fascinating and something not to try to explain today, but this has been a great conversation so far. Thank you so much for it. You're going to come back in a moment to talk about a seminal piece of art in your life, which I'm really excited about. But thank you so much, Annie.
So nice to be here.
As for the rest of you listening, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me here at 5 a.m. Story Talk. I hope my conversation with Anne made it worth your while. Don't run off just yet, though. As promised, there's a bonus episode to come. Anne returns to discuss a seminal piece of artwork from her life, the song Imoyo from Ricardo Lemvo and his band Máquina Loca. You can find a link for this in the show notes if you don't know the song. It's an incredible mashup of musical traditions, from Congolese to samba to Cuban. You're going to need to become a paid subscriber wherever you're listening to this, though. Alternatively, you can head to the show notes and subscribe to my 5 a.m. Story Talk Arts newsletter, where you'll get access to all of my podcast episodes days, weeks, and sometimes even months early, including every bonus episode like this one. You'll also get access to a ton of other arts articles, most of them focused on screenwriting and writing, many of them exclusive to paid subscribers. Upcoming guests of this podcast include Scott Derrickson, who co-wrote and directed Doctor Strange and the Black Phone, Mike Richardson, the founder and CEO of Dark Horse Comics, and Dr. Surekha Davies, philosopher and the author of the new book, Humans, A Monstrous History. Next week, I'll be joined by screenwriter Derek Kolstad, who wrote John Wick and co-wrote its next two sequels, which means you can call him the creator of the John Wick shared universe. Thanks again for listening, my friends. See you at the bonus episode for some more 5 a.m. Story Talk with epidemiologist Dr. Anne Rimoin.